Parents brought their children to him with complete trust. They called him Dr. Brad, and to them, he was more than just a doctor. He was the kind man who always had time to listen. He handed out lollipops, gave out colorful stickers, and made sure every child left with a toy. His office didn't look like a place for medicine. It looked like a child's dream. There were murals of cartoon animals, Disney characters on every wall, and even a working merry-go-round spinning outside his clinic. Laughter filled the air. To the outside world, he seemed like the perfect pediatrician. But behind the closed door of one small exam room, everything changed. That door locked quietly. Inside, a hidden camera pointed directly at the examination table. It had recorded something no one ever imagined, not just once, not twice, but again and again. One day, a 2-year-old girl walked out of that room crying. She couldn't explain what happened. She didn't have the words. But her silence was loud enough for her mother to sense something was wrong. And that mother would become the beginning of an investigation that shattered everything. It wasn't the first time a child had left that room in tears. And tragically, it wouldn't be the last. For years, no one had listened. Complaints were made. Warnings were given. But each time, they were brushed aside. The man behind the smile, the toys, and the cartoon walls was hiding something monstrous. Flash after flash. Headlines hit the news. Local pediatrician arrested. Over 100 children victimized. Hundreds of hours of video discovered. In the courtroom, as the details were read aloud, parents broke down. A mother collapsed to the floor. A father screamed in disbelief. The judge struck the gavel. And still, the number of victims kept growing. This isn't a story about a mistake. It's a story about evil, calculated, hidden, and protected for years. His name is Earl Bradley. He had a white coat, a smile, and access to thousands of children. He was reported more than once. Nurses spoke up. Other doctors raised questions. Even his own sister begged someone to intervene. But for over a decade, no one stopped him. By the time the police searched his office and pressed play on the tapes found inside, the damage had already been done. What they saw on those recordings shocked even the most experienced investigators. Hours of footage showed crimes too painful to imagine. Children, some still in diapers, were caught on video trying to run. Many didn't even have the strength to scream. This story is not easy to hear, but it must be told. Parents deserve to know the truth. And the victims, now older, many still silent, deserve to be remembered. This is the case of Earl Bradley, the pediatrician now known as the worst child predator in American history. I want to hear from you. How well do you know the people you trust with your children? Please share your thoughts below. Earl Bradley's life didn't begin in the quiet, idyllic town of Lewis, Delaware. It started in the bustling streets of Philadelphia, where he was born and raised. From a young age, he displayed a deep interest in medicine. He wanted to help people, particularly children. It was a path that seemed destined for him, one that would lead him to become a pediatrician, a protector of kids, a trusted figure for parents. He graduated from the Temple University School of Medicine in 1983, and after completing his residency at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in 1986, he was ready to begin his career. For many doctors, starting a career in a big city like Philadelphia could be overwhelming. But Earl Bradley thrived. He was highly regarded by his peers, and before long, he opened his own practice in Northeast Philadelphia, just a short distance from the hospital. To families, he was more than just a pediatrician. He was the go-to doctor for children in the area. He had a charm about him, a smile that made parents feel at ease as they brought their children in for their checkups. His office was welcoming, a place filled with bright colors and child-friendly decor. He seemed like the perfect doctor, one parents could trust with their most precious loved ones. But, as time went on, something began to change. Something wasn't quite right. In 1995, Bradley made an abrupt decision to move. His practice in Philadelphia suddenly shut down, and he relocated to a small town on the Delmarva Peninsula, Lewis, Delaware. The move was strange. It wasn't just sudden, it was poorly planned. Families who had been seeing him for years found themselves without an explanation, without any closure. There was no formal notice. Appointments were canceled without warning, leaving parents confused and concerned. No one knew why he had left so suddenly, but they soon discovered that this move would mark the beginning of a very dark chapter. Lewis was quiet, picturesque, a stark contrast to the crowded streets of Philadelphia. But Earl Bradley seemed to fit right in. He opened a new practice there, Babies Pediatrics, and it quickly became known as one of the most child-friendly offices in town. The decor was over the top, like something out of a child's fantasy. There were carnival rides in the waiting room, a giant statue of Buzz Lightyear from Toy Story, and even a small movie theater showing Disney films. To any parent walking in, it looked like the kind of place you would want to take your child. Bradley was quick to make his mark on the town, becoming a familiar face in the community, known for his eccentric style. But there were signs, subtle, odd red flags that no one seemed to notice. Around his home, Bradley had strange decorations, like a full suit of medieval armor displayed proudly on his porch. His cars were painted in yellow and black, resembling bumblebees, with eyes and tails, making them look like something out of a child's dream. His behavior was becoming more eccentric by the day. While many chalked it up to him simply being a quirky individual, others were starting to notice something wasn't quite right. Among those who started to see through the facade was his own sister, Linda Barnes. She had worked as his office manager for a time and became increasingly alarmed by what she was hearing from parents and staff. They had started to whisper about his odd behavior in the exam rooms, about him touching children in ways that felt inappropriate. Linda's concerns deepened as she learned that he wasn't just acting strangely. He was hiding something much darker. She would become one of the first to stand up and blow the whistle on Earl Bradley, exposing his twisted secrets to the world. But at the time, no one could have imagined just how far this story would go. Now I need you to think about the children whose lives were shattered by betrayal. Think about the children still out there, suffering in silence. By subscribing, liking, and sharing, you help ensure that their voices are heard. You're making a stand against abuse, raising awareness, and fighting for justice. Don't let their stories fade into the shadows. Subscribe, like, and share, because together, we can make a difference. At first, Earl Bradley's practice in Lewis seemed like the perfect place for parents to bring their children. His child-friendly office, complete with whimsical carnival rides and a giant Buzz Lightyear, made every visit seem like an adventure. But beneath the surface, cracks began to appear. It started with whispers, quiet complaints from parents who had noticed things they couldn't quite explain. The odd behavior wasn't just confined to his eccentric decorating. There were more subtle signs that something wasn't right. In 2004, Bradley's own sister, Linda Barnes, who had once worked as his office manager, began to hear unsettling stories from concerned parents. Some reported inappropriate touching during exams, while others described strange, unnecessary procedures that raised alarms. The complaints piled up, and Linda couldn't ignore them. She eventually reported the disturbing incidents to the State Medical Society. But what happened next shocked everyone. Linda revealed something even darker. Bradley wasn't just acting strangely in his professional life. She claimed that he had also abused his own son. At first, the allegations seemed unbelievable. Bradley was a well-respected pediatrician, a pillar of the community, and the idea that a person so trusted could be capable of such behavior was hard for many to grasp. But the whispers didn't stop. In 2005, more incidents began to surface. Nurses reported seeing Bradley videotaping children in his office, capturing innocent moments of play that made their skin crawl when they realized the true purpose behind the camera. Other doctors were now raising their concerns too, particularly regarding the unusually long and invasive vaginal exams that Bradley seemed to perform on young girls. Still, despite the mounting evidence, nothing seemed to be done. Bradley's reputation was still intact. No one could connect the dots, or perhaps no one wanted to. The medical and legal systems seemed unwilling to take action. Even after police in Milford, Delaware, investigated allegations of inappropriate touching and attempted to obtain a warrant for Bradley's arrest, the Attorney General's office declared there was insufficient evidence to press charges. This was just the beginning of a pattern that would continue for years. Allegations brushed aside, victims unheard, and Bradley continuing his practice, seemingly unscathed. In December of 2009, a breakthrough came when a disturbing complaint was made by the parents of a 2-year-old patient. This time, the child's mother was adamant. She described how her little one had become increasingly fearful of visits to Dr. Bradley, especially after certain examinations. Something about the way Bradley had handled her child during a routine checkup didn't sit right. This wasn't just a matter of discomfort. This was a feeling that something was wrong. The allegations came at a time when there had already been murmurs in the medical community, but now the whispers grew louder. Investigators began to look into Bradley's past, and what they discovered was beyond their worst fears. They found more victims, hidden behind the walls of the very practice that had been built to help children. The true horror of Bradley's actions came to light when law enforcement uncovered over 13 hours of video footage inside his home and office. What they saw on the tapes was too horrific to ignore. Children in diapers, screaming and crying as they tried to escape, but Bradley's sickening actions didn't stop. He had used his position of trust to manipulate, harm, and exploit the very children he was meant to protect. On the tapes, the children appeared dazed, even unconscious at times, as Bradley filmed the assaults. The victim's innocence was forever shattered, and the authorities were now faced with a case that defied understanding. Bradley's arrest came swiftly. He surrendered to the authorities on December 18, 2009. As the case against him grew, so did the number of victims. More and more families came forward, many of whom had trusted Bradley with their most precious loved ones. The full scope of his crimes seemed unimaginable. Over 103 victims were identified, including children as young as 3 months old. What was once a trusted pediatrician now stood accused of being the worst pedophile in American history. With his arrest, the community was in shock. How had this man, who had once been praised as a dedicated doctor, hidden such monstrous behavior for so long? It was clear that the medical community, law enforcement, and even his own family had failed to recognize the signs. Now, the truth was undeniable, and it was impossible to look away from the devastation Bradley had caused. As Bradley sat in a jail cell, awaiting his trial, the community began to question everything. What had they missed? How could they have let this happen for so many years? The trust they had placed in him had been violated in ways they never could have imagined. And while Bradley sat facing his charges, the true cost of his actions was still unfolding. How far would you go to protect your child if you felt something was wrong? Bradley was charged with a laundry list of heinous crimes. His bail was set at a staggering $2.9 million, an amount that would keep him locked away, unable to walk free. For someone with so many dark secrets, the arrest was just the beginning. Behind bars, Bradley was placed on suicide watch. His fall from the respected pediatrician he once was swift and final. In a matter of months, Bradley's legal representation switched from private lawyers to a public defender as his assets were frozen. It was clear that his life as he knew it was over. But what was to follow would be even more shocking: the public's reaction. Parents who had once trusted Bradley stood outside the courthouse in disbelief, some breaking down in tears, unable to comprehend the true extent of his betrayal. They had placed their children in his care, never knowing that they were walking into the very definition of danger. The courtroom was packed, filled with people who were struggling to process the horror that had unfolded in their community. In the midst of all this, Delaware Attorney General Beau Biden made it clear that he would not rest until justice was served. Biden had taken personal interest in the case, vowing to bring Bradley to justice and ensure that he would never hurt another child again. His involvement would not just be a legal matter. It was a personal crusade, one that he believed had to be fought with all the resources the state had to offer. This wasn't just about one man's crimes. This was a collective tragedy, a community shattered, and the beginning of a long battle for justice that would stretch for years. The charges against Bradley were staggering, growing in number with each new discovery. By 2010, the indictment had ballooned to 529 charges, covering 127 victims, each one with a story that demanded to be heard. It was clear this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just a medical professional gone rogue. This was the worst kind of predator. Bradley, facing the immense weight of these accusations, made a decision that would alter the course of his trial. In a move that shocked many, he waived his right to a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial. A trial to be judged solely by a single judge, the Honorable William C. Carpenter. The reasoning behind Bradley's choice remains unclear, but it was a decision that seemed to reflect the arrogance of a man who thought he could outwit the system. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Carpenter's disgust was palpable. He sat through hour after hour of testimony, hearing accounts that were so horrific they seemed almost beyond comprehension. There was no escaping the truth. The images, the details, the video footage, all of it painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Bradley had taken an oath to protect children, to care for them when they were at their most vulnerable, but instead, he had violated that trust in the most unforgivable ways. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. It was a moment that would be etched into the memory of all who witnessed it. On June 23, 2011, after months of hearings, the verdict was delivered. The silence that filled the room was deafening. Bradley was found guilty on all counts: 14 counts of rape, 7 counts of assault, and 3 counts of sexual exploitation of a child. He had been exposed for the monster he truly was. The moment the gavel fell, it was as if the weight of the world had finally come crashing down on him. There would be no more hiding, no more lies. Bradley's fate had been sealed. Judge Carpenter, in delivering the sentence, made one thing clear: Bradley would never again be in a position to harm another child. He was sentenced to 14 consecutive life terms in prison, plus an additional 165 years, without the possibility of parole. This was the maximum punishment the law could impose, and Bradley would spend the rest of his days behind bars, where he could never again hurt anyone. The courtroom breathed a collective sigh of relief, but for the victims, their families, and the community at large, the pain of what had been lost would never fully fade. The aftermath of Bradley's conviction reverberated far beyond the courtroom. In 2012, he made one last attempt to escape the justice he had been handed. He appealed his conviction, claiming the original search warrant was overly broad and that the police had exceeded their authority. But the Delaware Supreme Court rejected his appeal, affirming his sentence without hesitation. Bradley's fate was sealed, and there would be no chance for him to rewrite the history of his horrific crimes. In the wake of the trial, Bradley's former office complex, his twisted playground for abuse, was demolished in 2011. The space, once filled with brightly colored decorations and the false promise of safety, was now reduced to rubble. It was a symbolic gesture, a physical erasure of the horrors that had taken place within those walls. Yet, for the families of his victims, the pain could not be so easily destroyed. The victims and their families, once silenced by fear and manipulation, began to find their voices. They spoke out in interviews, documentaries, and public statements, sharing their heartbreaking experiences. Their pain was raw, their words filled with the weight of years of trauma. Some described the long-lasting effects on their children, the nightmares, the therapy sessions, the constant battle to reclaim a sense of normalcy. "Our lives will never be the same," one mother said, her voice breaking. The emotional toll of Bradley's abuse was immeasurable, and for these families, the fight for justice would never truly end. In a remarkable display of empathy, Delaware's Attorney General at the time, Beau Biden, who would later go on to become the state's Attorney General, took a stand to protect the victims even further. In an act of immense responsibility, Biden intervened when police had planned to auction off Bradley's personal belongings, including items in a storage locker. Fearing that those objects might one day be used again in a way that could harm the victims, Biden bought the contents of the locker for a symbolic $1. It was a gesture meant to ensure that Bradley's legacy of evil would not endure in any form, whether through physical mementos or otherwise. As the years passed, Bradley was moved from one prison to another. In 2016, authorities made the decision to transfer him out of state, away from the victims, their families, and the community at large. He was relocated to Connecticut, where it was deemed safer for both him and the people of Delaware. For many, this transfer symbolized the final distance between him and the nightmare he had left behind. But even in Connecticut, there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. The haunting legacy of Earl Bradley lingers still. His story is one of betrayal, of families who trusted him with their children, only to see that trust destroyed most unimaginably. But for the victims, there is hope. Their voices continue to echo, and their fight for justice has made it clear that, no matter how much time passes, they will never be forgotten. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Earl Bradley and the trauma his victims endured, the question that haunted many was, how did he get away with it for so long? The answer lies in a series of systemic failures. Failures within the medical field, law enforcement, and the very systems that were meant to protect the most vulnerable. For years, Bradley's disturbing behavior was overlooked, dismissed, or even ignored. Multiple warnings were raised, but each time, the system failed to act swiftly or decisively enough to stop him. In hospitals, his behavior raised red flags, unnecessary and invasive exams, an uncomfortable closeness to patients, and complaints from nurses and staff. Yet, nothing substantial was done to investigate these claims. There were whispers, but no real action was taken. Law enforcement was no better. For over a decade, there were repeated reports from concerned families, nurses, and even his own sister, Linda Barnes. But each time, authorities came up short. In 1995, when a nurse reported Bradley videotaping children, police found no grounds to charge him. In 2004, when his sister reported inappropriate touching, it fell on deaf ears. Even when parents complained directly, the investigation lacked urgency, and by the time proper action was taken, the scale of his crimes had grown beyond imagination. One of the most heartbreaking truths of this case came from Dr. Eli Neuberger, a pediatrician and expert on child abuse. Neuberger, who had spent nearly 40 years studying cases of child maltreatment, called Bradley's crimes the worst pediatric abuse case I've ever heard of. His words echoed the disbelief that so many felt. How could someone who was entrusted with so much power and the well-being of so many innocent children be allowed to continue for so long? But it didn't end there. Following Bradley's arrest, Delaware launched a review of its own processes. It became clear that the system had failed not just the victims, but the entire community. Hospitals, medical boards, and law enforcement agencies all had their part in letting Bradley continue unchecked. The state vowed to make changes to ensure that no child would fall victim to a predator in the same way again. But the damage was already done. The case of Earl Bradley prompted calls for reform and stricter accountability in medicine. How many more children would have to suffer before the system finally put safeguards in place? In the aftermath of this tragedy, the need for thorough investigations into medical professionals, especially those in positions of trust, became evident. Bradley's case was a stark reminder that the systems that were supposed to protect children were deeply flawed, and those flaws had allowed one of the most horrific cases of child abuse in American history to unfold. As we look back on the horrors that Earl Bradley inflicted on so many innocent children, It's impossible to ignore the truth. He built a kingdom of candy-colored lies, a world where families trusted him, where children laughed and played, and yet, hidden behind the colorful walls of his practice, he was carrying out unspeakable crimes. Hundreds of lives were shattered in the process. Families were forever changed. Children were robbed of their innocence. And all of this occurred under the watch of a man who wore the guise of someone meant to heal, someone meant to protect. To the survivors of abuse, your voices matter. You are not alone in your pain. There is help, and there are people who care about your healing. You are stronger than you know, and your courage can inspire others to come forward and find support. As we come to the end of this documentary, remember this: evil hides in plain sight. The more we stay silent, the louder it grows. We cannot afford to look away. We cannot afford to remain silent. The more we speak up, the stronger our fight becomes. If this story has moved you, please share this video to raise awareness and prevent another tragedy. Subscribe to stay informed and hear more true stories that demand justice, stories that need to be told. Let's stand together and ensure that these voices are never silenced again.